Well, Nigeria's fight against insecurity has lasted 13 years, with the problems taking new faces every year. From terrorism to banditry and kidnapping, Nigerians now live in fear. Local communities get ransacked and travelers are abducted on a daily basis. Now, this problem, which has traversed every part of the country, flashes different patches of darkness in different parts of the country. The issues are enormous and the fault lines stretch across Africa's most populous nation. In our Ondo state, in Nigeria's southwest region, scores were killed as they worshipped, and the roots of that devilry is still causing a debate amongst Nigerian leaders. Like you ask every day, with every news and every report highlighting Nigeria's security struggles, we ask, what's going on? Welcome to VSA. I'm Sulaiman. Well, the Nigerian government has linked the attack on France's Catholic Church on Sunday, June 5, to some attacks by terrorists. Whether it's ISWAP or not is another debate that the government is still unable to tell us clearly. Now, two governors in the southwest of the country have, however, rejected these claims because they say such allegations against specific terrorist groups are not evidence-based or are speculative. Banditry and terrorism are still foremost in the northeast and northwest of the country, with the north central now just as involved. 2 weeks ago, ISIS claimed an attack on traditional worshippers in Kogi State. 3 missionaries were also abducted in Lokoja, that's the capital of the state. Now, in Jos, Plateau State, a Christian Association of Nigeria chairman was also abducted. The southwest and southeast parts of the country are just as troubled, with new focus on the abduction of clergymen. Now, amid these negative security updates, 15,000 IDPs have returned to their homes in Borno 6 years after they had to flee for their lives. Now, 11 of the travelers abducted in Kaduna have also been freed, with many still held captive. Now, today we'll be unpacking so many of these issues with our security experts who will be letting us in on what truly is going on in Nigeria, more so now that the country is getting ready for the big national election in 2023. We'll take a moment. When we come back, we'll dig in deep on the security problems in Nigeria.
Since they graduated from stealing cattle to kidnapping and downing a military jet, there has been a clamor for criminals, or bandits as locals call them, to be branded terrorists. The government has now officially designated the activities of Mbindiga Group, known as gunmen in Hausa, Antada Group, and other similar groups as terrorists after a high court in Abuja made a similar ruling about the gangs. These development changes how the military can fight these criminals and what sort of weapons can be deployed. It is, however, not yet known how the new designation will affect the war in Nigeria's northwest and north-central regions. Security experts say the Super Tucano jet received last year from the US that could not previously be used against the bandits can now be deployed.
The areas that are affected by banditry, or what we may call the hotspots areas, the communities that are affected, we expect more security to be given to them. And we expect that adequate and more deadly weapons of warfare should be deployed by the military. This will also help anti-terror organizations around the world to monitor the activities of these guys. I think now we cannot call them bandits again. We should call them terrorists.
Also, prosecuting the bandits for the countless crimes they committed, from the kidnapping of school children to the theft of cattle, should be easier with the recent development. Suspects can simply be charged with terrorism rather than different offenses.
We're having issue of where to charge them, and they were using the normal criminal code to charge them. But when you are attacked as a terrorist, the judge himself has to sit up, the prosecution have to sit up, the defense counsel, knowing fully well the implication of being branded as a terrorist, and then the sentencing and the consequential penal measures that we meted out on conviction. So everyone has to sit up, and it will be given a accelerated hearing too, in order to make sure that they get justice.
Individuals, politicians, and communities known as enablers, among other categories that secretly support the bandits, may now think twice as they risk being linked to terror groups. Will there be a complete departure from ugly incidents that include incessant kidnappings, the rustling of cattle, imposing levies on host communities, among other illegal and criminal activities by these criminals? Time, they say, will tell. Ni Omani, News Central.
Well, a long fight that has been for Nigeria over a decade of fighting insurgency and insecurity in one part of the country that has snowballed into so many other parts of Nigeria. Kabir Adamu, who is a security expert and consultant, joins me now. Kabir, good to see you, and thanks for your time as always. And
My pleasure.
all right, the debate initially has to do with whether to qualify these people as terrorists or bandits. But the thing now is Nigeria has actually seemed to have been engulfed by pockets of insecurities. Now, what's been the biggest security challenge the country has faced in the last 13 years so far?
Thank you, Suleiman. It's good to be here once again. If we look at the definition of biggest, can be determined by a lot of things. But I mean, what would most people would probably agree when you are defining biggest would be the number of lives that have been lost. So prior to 2014, the threat factor that resulted in the highest number of deaths was simply terrorism. And for this, there were a couple of groups that were identified as terrorist groups in Nigeria. And the most virile one that resulted in more killings was the Jamaat al-Sunnah al-Dawat wal-Jihad, or otherwise the group called Boko Haram. In fact, in 2013 through 2014, it gained the infamous title of the deadliest terrorist group in the world. Now, between that year up until 2015, the splinter groups that made up this parent body, the Jamaat al-Sunnah al-Dawat wal-Jihad, were the groups that resulted in more deaths than any other threat factor in the country. But from that 2015 up until now, a combination of these terrorist groups plus gunmen whose identity has been quite evasive. So as a country, we've not been able to really disaggregate who they are. Sometimes we call them bandits. Sometimes we call them quote unquote Fulani herdsmen. Sometimes we call them terrorists, just like your report mentioned. And the government attempted to at least classify 2 categories of that group. And then sometimes they are called criminal gangs. So this have resulted in more deaths, as it were, than even the terrorist groups that were operating in the northeast, the Jamaat al-Sunnah al-Dawat wal-Jihad. So it depends on at what time and what the definition of the biggest that we're looking at.
I recall back then you had actually given Nigerians, some bit of historical background how they moved, bringing the Libya and the Maghreb into play. But again, the issue now has to do with the big question Nigerians are asking, because from Nigeria's northeast to northwest, we have seen some pockets of, or some signature of these criminals across the country. Do you think Nigeria, as it is, has the wherewithal to truly understand the impact of what it is dealing with?
Well, on the one hand, I would say yes, we have the wherewithal. But are we using that wherewithal? The answer is no. We have, to my count, about 27 ministries, departments, and agencies that are involved in security in the country. So that is numbers, 27 in any ramification in any country. If you have 27 ministries and departments and agencies involved in just one sector, that is huge. In some countries, you probably just have more than 3 or thereabout. In our own case, we've got that number. But then the next question is, how are we using those numbers? Are we using those numbers efficiently? And the answer, unfortunately, is no. You and I have discussed this, and we'll continue to discuss it. Most of these organizations are operating in silos. There is an unhealthy rivalry between them. Sometimes there is the issue of capacity. Persons have been employed within these organizations who, for one reason or the other, either because the recruitment process was faulty or because they were not properly trained, have been unable to meet the mandates. Then the big elephant in the room, corruption, where for a lot of reasons, their mandates are being moved to other areas that is not exactly their mandate. Then we should also look at oversight. The kind of oversight that exists within the security sector does not allow correction, even where these organizations deviate from their core mandate. The oversight function should be one that would now tell them, look, this is not what you were set up to do. You should go back to your core functions. We're not seeing that type of oversight in Nigeria, unfortunately. So yeah, I think we've got the wherewithal. What is lacking is all of these things that I've mentioned. And if we want to get it right, then we need to correct all of these things. I am not an advocate. I hear people saying that we don't have enough security agents. For instance, if you pick the police, the common narrative there is that we don't have enough numbers. I'm not an advocate of that. Rather, I would say before we discuss numbers, let's discuss utilization. How can somebody convince me when you have a situation where 10 police officers or even more are deployed to one individual who perhaps is not even entitled to them constitutionally, and yet somebody would sit and tell me that we don't have enough policemen? And I think no. My honest opinion is that we firstly should look at the utilization of the resources that we have.
And Kabir, if you let me jump in there, I think it's as important as every other aspect of our conversation, proper utilization of what we already have. And now you've just said 27, that's a huge number for any country to still be groping in the dark. Now, there are also suggestions that, also you already said you're not buying into that, talking about more personnel to be recruited into the police. We've seen the police lately, especially, recently, 5 police officers attached to an entertainment icon in Nigeria. I mean, 5 in a country that is fighting terrorism. How can the police be made to be more efficient in dealing with what Nigeria is handling at the moment?
2 levels of accountability. The first level is internal, and that means the police should strengthen its monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. In the first place, how many personnel does it have? Where are these personnel being deployed? When they are deployed to those locations, what kind of M&E, monitoring and evaluation mechanisms do they have in place to ensure that they stay in that place where they are deployed? Because sometimes they are deployed to certain locations, but then that particular location will now redeploy them for this type of assignments that we're discussing. So there must be some form of monitoring and evaluation functions. And in fact, in this digital age, it won't be too difficult to have some kind of tracking or surveillance capabilities, wearing body cams as an example, which has a lot of functions. It could be for operational reasons, but it could also be for tracking purposes. And that could run across the entire assets of the police, not just their human assets, their personnel, even their vehicles. You are living witness where vehicles are donated to the police and then frankly they disappear into thin air. And we've always said, look, the simple thing you can do is put tracking devices in those vehicles. You would know where they are being deployed. You know how they're being used. So there is enough technology to allow the police to do an internal M&E mechanism that will be effective and efficient, that will allow them to know where their personnel are. Now, asset tracking can have a lot of advantages. Time will not allow me to go into it, but it would, in simple terms, enhance efficiency and effectiveness. Now, the second level of accountability is the external one, and here it is the parliament that has that responsibility. The parliament, through its oversight functions, can look critically at some of these areas. Now you say you've got 350,000 personnel. Where do you deploy this 350,000 personnel? If you go to a state like Kaduna, you hear the number deployed there around 3,000 plus. So why is it that Kaduna, with its land mass, is getting 3,000? And another state, for instance, Port Harcourt, River State, is getting, say, 7,000. Is it because there are more lucrative contracts there from the oil companies, or what are the reasons? So that kind of external oversight, especially if you introduce monitoring and evaluation mechanisms too, from this external oversight, would help reduce this type of skewed deployment from the federal level. Now, apart from that, there are also some supervisory bodies, what I'll call regulatory bodies within the executive arm of government, such as the Police Service Commission and the Ministry of Police Affairs, that can also have some oversight functions within the police to ensure more efficient deployment of these resources that we're discussing. So there are different levels, and once these levels are effective, even if, for instance, the internal mechanisms fail, this external one should be able to pick up and correct whatever anomalies that exist. Unfortunately, all these three levels that I mentioned have not been very effective over the last few years.
Yeah, and it's very important that the external aspect which you highlighted, talking about Parliament, can actually come in and see how it can strengthen the internal aspect of it that seem to be having some gaps. But quickly here, it looks like deja vu. We saw what happened leading up to the 2011 election. Specifically, there was an upsurge in violence in some activities of the terror groups. But this time around, we're getting to see first what happened in Owo, in the church. And there seems to be a new focus of kidnappers on clergymen, especially those coming from prominent churches. So perhaps security intelligence can help decode this and what reasons may be.
So two things. First off, I think as part of our national counterterrorism strategy, we need to enhance the resilience of the population. In other words, teach the population about terrorism and what allows terrorism to thrive. And I'm saying this with all sense of responsibility. I have a commercial intelligence firm, as you know. I study development within the country, and I'm able to analyze and make projections based on this assessment or analysis that I do. Recently, His Eminence, the prelate of the Methodist Church, was abducted in the southeast of Nigeria, precisely, I think, in Anambra State. And he was released, I think, 3 days after his abduction. And he granted several interviews. Unfortunately, some of the statements he made in those interviews, the moment I heard those statements, I said, oh, no, I wish I had a way of reaching the Methodist Church. I would have advised them to tell him to tone down on some of the statements. Now, the criminal gangs that are out there listened to those statements. They heard how it was easy for for the church to mobilize and gather huge sums of money within 3 days, and not only gather those huge sums of money to pay those monies at ransom. So by that singular action, unfortunately, and I'm sure it wasn't his intention, he has put the lives of several other clergymen like him in danger. And unfortunately, that is what we're seeing. This is what intelligence does. Intelligence is able to tell you what will happen. We saw that the moment I had that interview, I knew that unfortunately that was going to happen. Now, we also unwittingly made the same mistake with the, or I hope I'm pronouncing it very well.
No, you're right.
All right, with the church incident. The publicity that incident got, unfortunately, has also made religious places of worship future targets. Anyone who wants to get that kind of publicity knows what to do to get that kind of publicity. And as weird as it sounds, there are several groups there that will enjoy this type of negative publicity. And quote and unquote, terrorist groups enjoy negative publicity. So I'm hoping that anyone who has security responsibility for places of worship, not just churches, but all places of worship that could be vulnerable to terrorist attack, they should put in place what we call anti-terrorism measures. These anti-terrorism measures have 4 layers. The layer to detect a would-be terrorist, the layer to deny a would-be terrorist from accessing the religious place of worship, the layer to delay that would-be terrorist, even if, for instance, he's able to come within the premises of that religious places of worship. And then the last layer is the response layer, where even if you detect him, you deny him, and he's still able to enter, and you delay him, then you are hoping that the response capability that is already in place will prevent him from the kind of carnage that we saw in Owo. So I'm advising all those with security responsibility for religious places of worship, both Christian and Muslim, and all the religions that we have within the country, they should try to put in place these measures. Unfortunately, the publicity that we gave the Owo incident means in the future, unfortunately, religious places of worship could be targeted.
And again, if I may borrow your word, unfortunately, it may happen if the education you spoke about, educating the population, isn't there already, because we're not trying to, pander, into politics now. But again, it would seem as if the Jonathan administration did show some bit of effort in educating and enlightening the public, because I recall then with the DSS and its spokesperson, and Frank Mba at that point in time was in the police, and the gentleman who was at the NOA, they had this weekly intelligence briefing for Nigerians. Is it too late or not for Nigeria to get into such kind of sensitization so that people understand what to say and what not to say and how to give information to these agencies? 27, you say.
It's not too late. That communication platform that you talked about, that was run under the Goodluck Jonathan administration, is a component of our national counterterrorism strategy. So it's still in existence. It has not been, it's not moribund. It's a living law. And so what has happened is the failure of the responsible government departments to implement the requirement of that national counterterrorism strategy. And perhaps one of the simple things that can happen is for just one person to remind them that, look, this is your responsibility. That center was called Center for Strategic Communication. Now, strategic communication is one component of our counterterrorism strategy. It's key. It's very, very important that as a country, we speak one voice against terrorism. And the only way we can speak one voice is if government galvanizes us. And the best way to galvanize us is to tell us what it is doing. I know it would be very unfair to say that this administration is not reeling out information. If you recall, there are these ministerial briefings that the administration started. I think it started in this second tenure of the President Muhammadu Buhari, or the first tenure, I'm not sure. However, there is a ministerial briefing. It still happens, but it's not getting the kind of publicity that Center for Strategic Communication got, mainly because perhaps the person responsible for media liaison was doing a better job than this current person who is handling this responsibility. But suffice to say that is a key component of our national counterterrorism strategy. And in my honest opinion, one of the things that we need to do as a country is to revisit and do an assessment of our capacity for the implementation of that national counterterrorism strategy. That strategy has been in existence since 2016. Now, I think it's high time to review it and see what aspects have we fared well in its implementation. What other aspects haven't we fared well? We've just pointed one out. In the communication aspect, frankly, we haven't fared very well. There is room for improvement. Perhaps there are several other components too that we may need to improve. The only land or country where terrorism is won, quote and unquote, is where the people take ownership of the counterterrorism strategy. Unfortunately, in Nigeria, our residents, our brothers and sisters are yet to take ownership of the national counterterrorism strategy. In fact, a lot of Nigerians don't even know that we have a national counterterrorism strategy. So we need to change that. Let every Nigerian take ownership of the national counterterrorism strategy so that they are able to contribute both by information and, more importantly, by rejecting acts of terrorism. Where you see on Twitter and several media platforms, people unwittingly accepting and encouraging aspects of terrorism, all it does is to strengthen the terrorist. But where as a country we understand that our actions can mar or make the success of our counterterrorism strategy, then I think we'll start winning.
You know, Kabir, I know you don't speak for the government. Clearly you're an expert and you're on your consultancy services. But again, we must say the way it is. This administration hasn't actually done well. If we try as much as possible to now remember some of the key things and talk about ministerial briefings, and you can just say that is one in many instances. And when they say, well, institutions or strong personalities can actually build some institutions, we remember then the NOA under Michael Mary did a yeoman's job in collaboration with these other agencies you spoke about. To the extent that at the moment, Kabir, isn't it amazing that intelligence still seems a thing we look down on in Nigeria, in Kaduna, in our attacks in the East? We see the governors have also refused to come together on the same page to say whether it is a terror attack or not. What do you think is happening at the moment where there is a disconnect between personalities in government of what truly transpired in these instances?
It's an unfortunate politicization of politics. Again, I'm going to emphasize with all sense of responsibility that I have no interest in all of this than to express my understanding of what is happening. It's sad that we're seeing a politicization of politics to achieve a certain interest. What happened in the war is clear. It is an act of terrorism against innocent worshippers, and we should have been able to deconstruct and make a very clear statement on what happened and hold those that allowed that thing to happen accountable. Almost 9 days after the incident, I'm not aware that a preliminary report has been released by any of the security agencies. I'm not aware that anyone within the security sector has been held accountable. Rather, what we're hearing are disparate statements by political leaders suggesting, for instance, a conspiracy theory, when frankly, there is no need for that. There were people in that church. Those people heard and saw what happened. If we were serious, we should have put at least a preliminary report together by now and put it out. You saw what happened in Kano. Now, whether irrespective of what perception people had. The police there put out a preliminary report, I think almost on the first day or on the second day, followed up with a follow-up report. And then they also promised the country that they are going to investigate further some of the substances that were recovered from the site, and that they will release a final report. And to an extent, that has put paid to the conspiracy theories that were flying around. So that's where functions and effectiveness is played. But where you have this type of politicization of issues, unfortunately, the result is this type of conspiracy theories that are flying around at the moment regarding what happened.
And Kabir, help us here make sense of the fad, or is getting into a culture now in Nigeria. The moment there is an attack or there is an incident, government agencies, journalists, they all troop to that place even before preliminary investigation. What does this mean for colleagues of yours or experts in security?
Thank you, Suleiman. This is one of the major concerns with responding to security incidents in the country. One of the first things that usually should be done is to safeguard the integrity of any crime scene, for the simple reason that when you safeguard the integrity, you allow for forensic investigation. Now, forensic investigation would allow the prosecution of whoever is responsible for that. But where you allow for the, as it were, tarnishing or the destruction of this evidence, then it would be almost impossible to prosecute the suspects eventually. You and I saw how in that church, everybody, journalists, political leaders, name them, went into that church, stepped on the locations, even the blood stains that were on the floor. Perhaps on that blood stain, some of the perpetrators had stepped on it and their shoe marks would have been there. And forensic investigators would have harvested that type. There were bullet shells, and I can bet you some people picked up those bullet shells, and those bullet shells are lying perhaps in people's houses, and people will be using them as, whatever they want to call them, to show people in the future that this is from the war. When those bullet shells could have been used as forensic evidence to allow for investigation. Where were those bullets purchased from? Who handled them? How did they arrive at all? All of that would be evidence that can be used to unravel what actually happened. Unfortunately, despite the promises we've had from our political leaders, I recall precisely in President Buhari's inaugural speech in 2015, he mentioned this particular issue where he told us that he's aware that security departments do not have evidence rooms, and that his administration is going to support the construction of evidence room as well as facilities for the safeguarding of evidence. And he made that link, very important, between law enforcement and the judicial process, because it is law enforcement that would gather this evidence, safeguard this evidence in these evidence rooms, and then present the evidence. I mean, all of us, we watch these movies on Netflix and other platforms. We see how before they enter a crime scene, they put gloves, they wear something around their shoes. They will not tamper with anything within that. Even the littlest of things within that crime scene can be used as evidence. The trajectory of the bullet, namely the hair on the body of the perpetrator, name them. All those can be harvested as evidences. In our own case, unfortunately, despite this realization in 2015 by our president, I'm yet to see a lot of progress in this area. I would always recall one of my most unfortunate experiences as a citizen in Nigeria. You recall the bombing incident that happened in 2014 in Nyanya, Abuja. It was a vehicle, and the person that was in charge of the investigation of that incident recovered the steering wheel of that vehicle. What he did was to place that steering wheel on his table. Everybody that comes to his office, he will point to that steering wheel and say, this is a steering wheel recovered from the bombing incident in Nyanya. Naturally, the visitor would touch that steering wheel. And by doing that, he has destroyed whatever fingerprints were on that vehicle. And now if you multiply that by the thousands of people that would come into his office, so clearly the evidence that could have led to the prosecution. But I mean, if you can tie somebody's fingerprint to the steering wheel of the vehicle that was driven to a location where the bomb went off, remember that there were bombs in that vehicle. So if you can tie the person through his fingerprint to that vehicle, then frankly, what a judge would almost be 100% convinced that that person is guilty. But if you can't tie him, then that person is likely to walk away. And that is why we found it really difficult to prosecute a lot of these persons who, I mean, even in kidnap for ransom cases, the infamous case of Evans is still lingering and all that. So that's one key area that we need to change if we're going to improve on the prosecution of suspects within the judicial system.
So now this enlightenment or education, for the population goes beyond the population. It must also stretch into the agencies that should know, because now we have seen that sometimes they also compromise, forensic. But quickly here, I need to go back to what you highlighted about officers and men, talking about the numbers. And this time around, every time we have an incident, Nigerians always talk about our troops. Suddenly, the country has forgotten that there is a police force. There is a police force, Kabir, and quite sadly so, Nigerians have seen more and more police officers deployed to, watch over individuals. The trending story of a musician in Nigeria having 5 policemen who shot at civilians in a clubhouse is still trending. What can we say of this about our police to the extent that the bulk percentage of the citizens are left unprotected, while just a few would have not 1, not 2, 5 and more police keeping watch?
Yeah, so first off, there is the United Nations recommended ratio, about, I think, 1 to 400 citizens, or in certain instances, they will tell you 1 to 500. So let's go with the 1 to 400. Based on that, we do have the need for more police personnel. But where it becomes complex, and I don't want to make this a little bit complex than it is, if you define the word policing, you find out that in Nigeria, we have several government departments that are actually carrying out policing functions that are not called police. So if we're going to get the right number of police personnel, and I'm speaking now as an international expert, if we're going to be fair to that UN recommended ratio, we now need to include those other government departments. And I'll quickly mention them. The road safety, the Federal Road Safety Corporation, that is a policing function. If you travel out of Nigeria, as an example, go to a country like Germany, it's the police that carries out the function that the road safety is carrying out. Likewise, in several other countries of the world. So they are, to an extent, a policing department. And if you look back at their history, they were actually carved out of the police. So I'm right in that regard. The second one is the civil defense, even though this is a little bit arguable. Some would say, no, they are not necessarily a policing function. But what is their mandate? The protection of critical infrastructure. Go to other countries of the world. Who does that? It's a combination of the police and sometimes the military, depending on the criticality of that function. So yes, they are also arguably policing functions. And even the immigration, you can extend that argument. There are certain countries where it is the police that carries out immigration functions. All that happens is that there is a specialized department within the police that carries out immigration functions. So what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that for us to contend with that argument that there are not enough police personnel, we should add these other government departments that carry out policing functions and then see how they are deployed. Now, are they deployed in a manner that allows for cross-cutting cooperation between them, or are they deployed where there is no level of cooperation between them? And unfortunately, the latter is the case in Nigeria. There is very little cooperation between the core police unit and these other subunits. In fact, the irony is that even the ministry that supervises them have been separated. You have a Ministry of Police Affairs that supervises the police, while you have the Ministry of Interior that kind of oversees the functions of all the other policing departments. So very little coordination at that management or top management level. Back to your question, the police exist, but the police is faced with a myriad of challenges, and I've just mentioned one of the challenges, the fact that it is subdivided into several units. Then unfortunately to corruption. The part of the reason why you have a deployment of police to individuals that are not constitutionally entitled to policing functions is really because of policing, of corruption. The third element is the inability of the police to embrace change. The private security function, what we call industrial security in Nigeria, has matured. And it will shock you, Suleiman, that private security function in Nigeria is providing employment to almost 10 million Nigerians.
I'd like us to talk more about that, just talk about the functions and not to give out some clues to those that talking about not classified. Let's talk more about activities of the private security outfits. I know you're a member of that body in Nigeria. Let us in on what exactly they're doing to help stem what we're dealing with at the moment.
So let me be as basic as possible. There is no private business, no private individual who has some form of fence or perimeter fencing around his area that does not have a private security personnel deployed to his house. So that will give you an idea of the spread of private security personnel. And this is just man guarding that I'm talking about. Now, there are other private security firms that are providing functions such as surveillance. They are providing, CCTV installation. There are others even, and amazingly, I because I'm into it, I know this. There are private security functions that have drones and that are able to sell that service, not to private individuals now, but to government. And so government would engage them, and they will be managing and operating those drones. There are others who conduct high-level assessment and investigation. There are others who are involved in certain aspects of logistics that are within the security function, so moving cash from point A to point B, and a whole lot of functions beyond what I've just mentioned. Cybersecurity is also there. It's a growing field. In fact, there are more requirements for roles in cybersecurity than there are persons to fill those requirements. And in fact, a lot of young Nigerians are being offered jobs outside the country from cybersecurity roles. So there is the private security function in Nigeria has really matured.
And what can Nigeria learn moving forward? Because this is all about tackling and stemming the spread of insecurity in Nigeria, more so especially as the country moves into an election year.
Suleiman, I'll just mention two things, frankly, accountability and responsibility. They are Siamese twins, or they are sometimes the same side of one coin. But in this instance, I'm using them differently. Let me start with accountability. I spoke about it earlier. We need to start holding our security sector, members of that sector, accountable. They need to be answerable to us as Nigerians. And that means we need to democratize the security function. Now, it would be a Herculean task because the military legacy that has been left behind has left a huge stain within the security sector. They see themselves as untouchable. They see themselves as over and above the ordinary civilian, quote unquote. And so subjecting themselves to democratic oversight would require a lot, but we need to do that. You have witnessed congressional hearing within the US, and you see how anyone coming to a congressional hearing, irrespective of whether he's a four-star general he's worried, he's scared, because he knows that if that hearing finds him or her guilty, it would result to either prosecution. Of course, he or she will lose his job and he may be liable to prosecution. So we need to go to that point where our members of the security sector know that they are accountable to us. If they allow a train to be targeted and over 60 or even more Nigerians are abducted, someone somewhere should be held accountable within the security sector, because we paid him money, we've appointed him, we've appointed her to make sure that doesn't happen. We should not have a situation where that takes place and nobody is held accountable. A church was attacked in Owo and nobody has been held accountable. We need to change that. We need to make sure that when incidents like that happen, somebody somewhere is held accountable. Over the weekend, persons went for a wedding in Sokoto. On their way back, their vehicle broke down. Today, 29 of them are still missing. Nobody on that stretch of route has been held accountable. Meanwhile, there are over 8 or 9 agencies that collect money from both the federal and state governments and say they are going to provide security on that route. They didn't provide that security. They should be held accountable. So accountability. Now, the other component is the responsibility component. If you are appointed to head the security department, your mandate is clear. That mandate tells you what to do. It tells you what not to do. If you are a citizen, what is your civic responsibility to the country? Now, we also need to look critically at that. Are we both from the side of those that are in government departments to the side of citizens? Are we all taking our own role or our own part within this civic space? Are we contributing correctly to security? Or are we reasons why there is, insecurity within the country, both from the side of those that are holding public office positions to the side of citizens who should have been contributing through their civic responsibility? So again, I say these are two sides of the same coin, but there are things that if we want to change the narrative around security, we need to enhance them. Now, lastly, like you rightly said, we're in an election year. And right now, we're hearing a lot of campaign gimmicks. I'm yet to hear the kind of right messaging I need to hear within the security sector. I've talked about M&E. Any candidate who comes to tell me that he's going to introduce M&E, and then not only says it, but also shows how he's going to introduce it, then he has my vote. And I'm hoping that a lot of Nigerians will align to this and then start discussing and demanding from these candidates that this is what we want. And then they now tell us during the campaign period that that's what they are going to do. Now, the typical Nigerian would say, well, even if we vote them in, they're not going to do it. But at least if they put it within their agenda, we'll be able to ask them critical questions once they win to say, okay, you promised us you're going to do this, as against if they don't even discuss it. So yes, let's start asking that question. I need, and I'm hoping that I would see promises that some form of accountability measures will be introduced within the security sector.
I think it's a fine place for us to leave it because now you've been able to, alert Nigerians on some of the key questions they should be asking the candidates. Don't just tell us, show us how. And, also the tips there for religious places and critical infrastructure, how to detect, deny, delay, and also respond to any threats. And I'm hoping that the experts will be consulted to help out on this. It's everyone's business. Kabir Adamu, many thanks for your time, for being such nice company as always. I'm Sulaiman. Later. Bye-bye, Africa.